All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an update on the Kansas Promise Scholarship Act. I'm Katie Geyer, and I'm with the Data Research and Planning Unit. Please make sure you are muted, especially if you are calling in. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted later today or tomorrow on the Kansas Promise Act webpage. On the Kansas Promise Act webpage of the KBOR website. Please type any questions you may have in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We won't be answering any of those questions today. Rather, we will gather these questions and prepare the answers to be added to the established Promise Act FAQ that is also posted on the Promise Act webpage. Right now, we are adding new questions as we receive them to the end of the FAQ. Once things quiet down a little bit, I will try to rework these FAQs so the questions are grouped in similar categories to hopefully make it easier to find your answers. As it stands right now, we are at 51 questions and answers in this document, so keep them coming. If you have any questions after today's webinar, please send those to promise@ksbor.org, and we will work to answer them as quickly as we can. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Flanders.
All right, thank you, Katie, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. We at KBOR are excited about how the Promise Act could be implemented and the things that it could actually do for students in our state and companies who need a skilled workforce. And as with any new program, we have a lot of details to work out. Now, I've heard a few concerns. I just wanted to address those initially. I know there's concerns about the clawback piece of the legislation and the role of institutions in clawbacks, whether or not a student completes on time, whether or not a student lives and works in Kansas. And I just kind of want to allay some of those fears and just say we're going to work on that. I think we may have a pathway to do that centrally. So I don't want people to worry about that. At this point, I think our efforts need to be focused on how are we going to get these funds awarded to the appropriate students at the right time. So we really want to focus on how do we get the act up and running. And I don't want people totally focused too much on how we implement the back end of the legislation. I know that our team appreciates all the feedback that they've been getting. Again, I agree with Katie. Please keep that feedback coming. We've posted an application form. I've gotten some feedback on the application that perhaps we need to add a space where students can list the scholarships they've received. We appreciate that input, and where we can, we'll try to make those changes. Your institutions have received several documents: the funds disbursement agreement, the service agreement and promissory note, and the recipient status verification form. We've gotten some feedback on those forms as well. And I will tell you that the funding doesn't come until July 1, but we still have some question and we haven't settled on exactly how the funding's going to be dispersed. So give us time. We're working with leadership from the community colleges, the technical colleges, and the independent colleges, and really trying to determine the best path forward as we look at how those disbursements will be made. Again, we should receive the 10 million appropriations soon after July 1st. And then once we receive those funds, we can begin to distribute to eligible institutions. So again, I thank you for joining us. Please continue to send any questions and feedback, and we will keep updating that portion of our website to keep you informed. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Julene Miller.
Okay, thank you, Blake. Okay, so as Blake mentioned, earlier this week, we emailed 3 new documents out to each of the eligible institutions. I think Scott Smathers sent the draft Promise Act agreement to the college and university presidents, thinking that would be the best place for those to land. And Diane Lindeman sent the draft Promise Scholarship Service Agreement and employment verification form to each of the institutions. There's a financial aid. These forms are in draft at this time. We're inviting feedback on each of them before finalizing them. There's two versions of the Promise Act agreement. One was for eligible public and private 2-year institutions, and the other is for the eligible private 4-year institutions. The only difference in the drafts is the section that discusses limits on the amount of the Promise Scholarship that may be awarded, and that's pursuant to Section 4A1 and 4A2 of House Bill 2064. The draft agreement is currently in a fillable format that will allow for a digital signature. However, once we finalize the agreement, the board office will fill in the first 2 fields with the legal name of the institution and the amount of the institution's disbursement for FY 2022 or whatever amount of disbursement we end up deciding to do, if it's all at once or if it's in installments. We want to keep the agreement generic at this point so that when we have a final version, they're all the same except for individualizing them with the names and contact information for the individual institutions. The Promise Act agreement is particularly important in this first year of the program because it's standing in the place of regulations for now. That's allowing us to get off to a faster start than we would be able to if we had to have regulations in place. The Rule and Regulation Filing Act, some of you may know, others may not. It requires a fairly lengthy process for drafting, processing, conducting a public hearing, and then adopting the regulations at a board meeting. So this couldn't all be accomplished in time for a fall 2021 start to the program. We may find that we don't need an agreement for next year if we're able to get the regulations in place before we disperse the scholarship funds for fiscal year 2023. Please look this agreement over carefully. Contact Scott Smathers if you have any questions, suggestions for clarity or other concerns. We tried to stay close to the language of the bill so that there shouldn't be any conflicts between the provisions in the agreement and the provisions that are in the bill. The agreement does, however, identify who is responsible for what and the timing of various things such as disbursement of the funds, application deadline, those kinds of things. We will certainly review your feedback as it comes in and as quickly as possible. So that we can send the final version of the agreement to each institution before July 1. And as you all know, that's the effective date of the Promise Act, so we can't really take action before the act takes effect. Within 10 business days, receipt of the final version of the institution's agreement, their executed agreement, the board office will disperse the institution's funds. And I just, again, emphasizing the importance of the agreement, entering into that agreement and accepting the dollars signifies the institution's agreement to receive, deposit, and administer the funds in compliance with the terms of the House bill and the Promise Act agreement. So, Katie, what slide are we on here? You can move to 6. Second document emailed to the eligible institutions this week is a draft of the Kansas Promise Scholarship Service Agreement that must be entered into by the institution in each student who's awarded a billable format. It will require the institution's financial aid office to complete some of the fields and the student recipient to complete other fields. The service agreement is patterned after service scholarship agreements used by the board office, but it is tailored to the Promise Act. It spells out the student's commitment to complete a Promise eligible program on time and to reside in and commence work in Kansas for 2 consecutive years within 6 months of either completing the Promise program or any further education in a Kansas post-secondary educational institution, or to commence service as a military service member. The service agreement also contains other conditions the student must meet to obtain and keep the scholarship, such as completing the FAFSA enrolling in a promise eligible program, maintaining enrollment of at least 6 hours in the program each semester, and maintaining records and making annual reports to verify continued compliance with the service agreement. The student also agrees to repay the scholarship with interest if at any time they are determined by the institution to no longer be in compliance with the agreement or the Promise Act. The service agreement specifies how a scholarship award may be repaid and how installment payments would work. This agreement also outlines the various ways a student may satisfy the scholarship conditions and the various good causes, it's air quotes, good causes for which any requirement of the agreement may be postponed. These satisfaction and postponement provisions dovetail with the provisions in the recipient status verification form that Diane will speak to, but that was the third document that went out this week. Finally, the service agreement contains a paragraph by which the student recipient consents to the release of such student record level information as may be needed to ensure compliance with the agreement and for the program auditing purposes. So that was fast. I know this is being recorded and the slides will also be on our website. But at this point, I'll turn it over to Diane Lindeman, the board's director of student financial assistance. Thank you.
Thanks, Jolene. First off, I want to thank a lot of you for the feedback that you did provide us in putting together this application form. It was very helpful to us in creating it. And I want to take a few moments just to kind of go over some of the aspects of the application with you. The cover page that goes with the application is one that contains a lot of information about the scholarship. You know, it provides the eligibility requirements, the application procedures, as well as highlights that the scholarship is a service obligation scholarship, which requires the students to live and work in Kansas for 2 years after the completion of their program of study. So that piece is really important for the student to have that coincides with this application so that they know exactly what they would be getting into. Now, if a student's program of study does extend beyond 1 year, the student will need to complete a renewal application, which is something that we will need to add to the current application so that it identifies that that student is a renewal. We want to do that because that does continue to keep that student's information updated, because as you know, a lot of things change with students, their emails, their phone numbers, their addresses all the time. So it's a good way to kind of keep up to date on that. Now, the application is on the Board of Regents website, and I would encourage you to place it on your financial aid website as well. And I was asked recently about this application and whether it could be made into an electronic format by the school or whether that exact application would need to be used. And you can put this application in an electronic format on your website as long as it does contain all of the information that is on the application. Now, the first page of the application itself, and I'll have Katie pull that up, is really pretty self-explanatory. On that piece, we're just gathering, basic information on the students, their name, address, phone, email. We're also asking some questions about residency and whether they're a dependent child of a military service member. Yeah, I think if you continue to scroll down, we'll get to the actual application. Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. Yeah, so this first part is the contact information. It's just basic kind of directory information, etc. And then we are asking about their residency and the military dependency question, because that is one of the questions that would enable a student to have eligibility for that. And then we're also gathering a little bit of information about their educational information, their educational plan. And as we know, sometimes students don't know those exactly as they start the programs, but we're hoping they at least kind of have an idea of knowing whether they plan to be part-time, full-time, what the program they want to be in, and maybe some sort of an idea of an anticipated date of completing the program. Now, the next page of the application is very important, as it is the section where the student would be certifying that they understand that the scholarship is a service agreement and has a service component to it. And at the bottom of that page, then is the information that would be useful to you as a financial aid administrator, because that's where the students you can put in the information about the student's program of study, the zip code that identifies that program, And then also the section for you to calculate the student's award. So Katie, if you'll scroll down just a little bit, yeah, there we'll get to that part. So I think this will be helpful to you in knowing this. Now, Blake had mentioned that there was some suggestion about having the student enter some information about what awards they might be receiving. That might be a good suggestion. Of course, we also know that sometimes students don't always know what they're getting or how much. You always have to kind of know that some of that information may or may not be completely accurate. So we'll have to think about that, though, as placing that in there, because that could be something real helpful to you. As we go through this first year, we'll really want you to help us with this, to provide feedback on this application. You know, what works, what doesn't, what needs to be added or taken out. We know there will be things that we'll want to continue to tweak as we go through this. Now, if we move on to the recipient status verification form, and I'll have Katie pull that one up. That would be a form that's going to be sent to the students, and this would just be done on an annual basis to gather information to determine what their situation is. The first section is going to be just, again, basic information. It's a way to kind of keep up, again, if the student has made any changes, also any additional people that you might need to make contact with if you're trying to locate the student. Sometimes that kind of information can be extremely helpful. And then the information about whether they've completed their program of study or not. Section B would be employment status. So this would be that they'd have the name of the employer and a little information about when they started, whether they're full-time, part-time. It would be signed by a verifying employer official. I have already received one suggestion that we include more information than the employer address. So maybe other contact information, an email, phone number, that kind of thing. So that's really a good idea to include on that. On the second page of that form, then we would have the information about their request for postponement or deferment. So there are the check boxes where those are the various things that allow a student to perhaps postpone or defer their obligation. If they have any kind of special circumstances, they need to provide documentation of what those circumstances may be. Again, this would kind of depend on the situation. I know for some of our current programs, perhaps if there's a medical situation, we would ask that a physician provide some documentation on that. And also one thing that we know we need to add, and it might need to be a special section, would be for military, because if a student does decide to join the military, they can be released from their obligations. So it's not really a postponement or deferment category, but is kind of their own separate section that we would have like a military unit sign off on. The bottom section there, the section D, would be the college enrollment verification. So a lot of times a student's going to continue to be enrolled. That's fine. They would just indicate that they are, and then a school official can sign off on that to verify that that's the case. Again, we'd want to have you let us know how this works for you. This is a lot of this information on this form is information we've used for our other service programs for many years, and seems to work pretty well for us as far as the kind of things that we need to know about. But again, this is a different program, so there might be things that you'll see that you would like to have added or find it's not necessary. So we'd really like to know about that. I thought I'd take just a few minutes to kind of go over some of the questions that we have received that are financial aid related. So I'll take just a few minutes to do that. We had a question that came in to ask us what we define as part-time enrollment. And the Promise Act does define part-time as 6 or more credit hours, but less than full-time. So full-time is not defined in the bill, but we are using the 12 credit hours a semester as the full-time. Another question came, what if someone were to live outside the state of Kansas, but they work in the state? The issue is there that the Promise Act does require the recipient to live and work in Kansas for at least 2 years after completion of their Promise eligible program. And there are timeframes within which these two requirements must be met. So they would not be meeting the requirement if they're living outside of the state, even if they are working in the state. Another question was, if the student does not return the information as far as post-Promise Act, who's responsible for getting the information? Same question for collection of repayment by the student if they choose not to comply with the agreement. The institution will not be responsible for obtaining will be, that's very important, will be responsible for obtaining the required application and student agreement forms from the student. Funding cannot be released to the student until all forms have been received by the institution. If a student does not submit the information that is needed to track their service, they can be considered in default and may need to repay the amount of the scholarship assistance they received plus interest. So it's really on the student to be sure that they are following this all along, submitting all the forms when they need to, and letting you know when there is any changes that happen. Another question came through that asked whether the Act covers books, tuition, and fees, and tools, supplies, and maybe housing costs. The Promise Scholarship will cover tuition, required fees, books, and required materials. If tools and supplies are required for the program of study, they can be included. Housing costs are not included. In addition to that, a person had asked about whether a student's digital devices could be included in materials. If tools and digital devices are required for the student's program of study, they can be included as required materials. Another question came through that if a student has a scholarship that would come in later in the semester, does that mean the money has to go back to be paid to the Promise Act fund? Now, this situation could cause an overaward for the student, and you would follow your school's policy for this situation, and it may depend upon the timing of the receipt of the additional scholarship. If it's outside of your school's standard refund schedule, it may be okay to allow the student to keep the outside scholarship. This may be something that would need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. We also had a question about what is the meaning, or how do we define last dollar scholarship? Well, last dollar scholarships, as their name implies, are intended to be paid after all other financial resources have been awarded. The calculation of the last dollar amount is based on the gap between what aid has been awarded and what aid is still needed to help a student meet their cost of attendance. With a Promise Scholarship, student loans and work study will not be included as counting toward the student's financial resources. Another question was, if a student attends an eligible program and receives a Promise Scholarship and then transfers to another community college in Kansas to enroll in an eligible program, how are we going to know how many months of eligibility the student has left? This will result in some challenges. The schools will need to communicate with one another if they have a student who's received a Promise Scholarship. Each school will need to monitor their students, and if a student transfers to another school, that information will need to follow that student. Another question was, if I receive scholarships over multiple years, the applicable interest rate is the time in which I was awarded my first scholarship, correct? Yes, your interest rate would be at the rate that was in place at the initial awarding of the scholarship and would remain at that rate until the time upon which the student would have completed their service. Question came through that, is there a credit hour limit? A student can utilize Promise Act dollars to apply towards expenses in eligible programs. They said that they'd heard the figure 60 credits. However, many of the AAS degrees have more than 60 hours to complete the program, as 68 hours is allowed by KBOR policies. The Promise Act does not limit the number of credit hours a student may receive assistance with. However, the student must complete the program no matter the number of hours within 30 months of the initial Promise Scholarship award. And lastly, has it been determined what is going to be used on the FAFSA to verify the family income? The income threshold will be determined by the adjusted gross income. All right, I think, Elaine, you might be next.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Diane. So I'm going to we can go on. Yes, thank you, Katie. Since last week's webinar, so many of you might have been on Scott Smathers' webinar from last week. He talked about the program identification process and how that all worked with our workforce development staff and our data folks. And truly, this has been a cross-agency project for us, a lot of people involved. So not only Diane and our financial aid team. So last week, the Post-Secondary Technical Education Authority did have their meeting, and they reviewed eligible programs, and they have put forth recommendations for the Board of Regents. And the board will consider those for final approval during their meeting on June 16th and 17th. So we're about ready to launch on what programs are eligible. And then on the next slide, I want to talk just a little bit about distributions. So our agency was appropriated $10 million for fiscal year 2022. On July 1, we will have that amount available to distribute to the institutions. The Promise Act itself does decree that our agency make allocations to institutions and not to individual students. So again, where Jolene mentions responsibilities for institutions, it is the institution's responsibility to make individual awards in concert with other aid and assistance that students might have available, because the school, the financial aid office, would have that information. Now, as we thought about how are we going to manage this $10 million appropriation, how do we disperse funds to individual institutions? We wanted a rational methodology. We wanted all institutions eligible, all 33, to benefit from a portion of the state funding. And to be clear, the appropriation is for scholarships. The line item is a single line item. It's not for administrative funding. It is for student scholarships. So we want that funding to go to students for them to complete their programs. In this first year, absent anything tangible of how we would go about this, we are going to rely on identifying colleges' credit hour production from the Promise eligible program. So that our data staff are working right now to identify how much credit hour production was generated in the eligible programs that were approved last week from the TEA. So we know from their action what those are. So we're isolating Kansas resident students, adult students, so not high school students, in courses tied to the eligible programs where the student didn't fail or withdraw. So that's sort of been our parameters for how we're identifying the courses. So this is how we're going to approach it for year one. As we know more and learn more, we could change course and do something different or better for next year. Now, we have also had a discussion about the timing of the distributions that our agency will make to colleges. We have not finalized our plans. We simply want to make sure students have the benefit from this state scholarship. We're excited that we have a new need-based aid program, but we don't want to have a land rush. We don't want first come, first serve, just to run on the funding. So we are still working to figure out what is the best and most efficient way to get the dollars from this appropriation to the colleges. We won't be able to send in the money until we have a signed agreement that Jolene discussed earlier in the webinar. But there will be communications with each individual college about getting the agreement signed and how we will distribute the funds to the college and what your allocations will be. So if we go on to the next slide, I think is the last slide. We will not have a webinar on Promise Act next week. So we've had 3 now, but next week, I hope you're all registered for data research and planning. The unit is having their annual data conference next week, which will be a webinar on Zoom. So hopefully you're all registered. That is a 2-day event. And we will talk a little bit about Promise Act and how that impacts our data collections. As we've talked about this is an evolution. This is an evolving program. We're developing it from scratch. It feels a little bit like we're building the plane while we're flying it. So we will try to find ways to minimize the impact that data collections will have on our data folks, our friends at the campuses, and try to collect the amount of information and the types of information we'll need to administer the program. There is a report that's required from our agency to the legislature every year. So we will have to figure out what data we're going to need to create that report. So there will be more information about data, distributions, and all the funding. And look for another webinar the following week. So next week, data conference. The week after, look for another webinar. Okay. So I think there's one last slide with a reminder. Yes, our Promise Act website and the email address. I know you've sent some emails in today, and we've also got some Q&A on there today in this webinar. So we will answer those, get you those answers as soon as we can. And I think we're going to wrap it right there. So we got in under 30 minutes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good week. Take care.